Well, good morning, everybody. It's wonderful to see you all here from so many different places, and particularly congratulations to those of you who came from overseas, which is no mean feat at the moment. So thank you so much. I'm just introducing today's amazing event, and then I'm handing over to Ryan. So I shall begin with a few reflections on the importance of today for the world. Just reflecting on the nature of the world since the beginning of 2020, it seems, if one reflects on just these short 2 months, that our world is on fire, it is underwater, it is blasted by winds. We're succumbing to plague and fever, and we're told not to shake hands, to keep our distance, to self-isolate, when we receive communion, we're to receive in only one kind, we're not to exchange handshakes at the peace, even the bishops have decreed. So it is a very extreme 2 months in which we've had to adjust to a very different kind of world. More broadly, if you look at political configurations, populations don't seem to agree with elites, and elites seem to despise populations. Human rule over nature is destroying it. Human rule over other human beings is collapsing. Our era seems apocalyptic. Life is under threat thanks to our own actions. Knowledge as wisdom appears to have drained away. We seem to be returning ourselves to some kind of bare-toothed subsistence, or destroying ourselves and the planet to leave only a bare existence behind. But to believe in the Trinity and a Trinitarian framework is to believe that existence is inherently life and understanding, and that their intrication can never be undone. Neoplatonists such as Porphyry had already affirmed that the one proceeds via life into intelligent expression. They had even begun to see how the triad of being, life, and intelligence might be rooted in the ultimate one itself. But in general, they saw the outgoing from the one into life, intelligence, soul, and finally matter as some kind of decline, albeit one from which there was an inevitable rebound back to the origin. With the Christian reworking of this triad, above all for Marius Victorinus, things are different. God himself is seen to be a non-declining horizontal motion, paradoxically identical with his rest. In God, to be and to live and to understand are all the same. But to understand presupposes life, which in turn presupposes being, and so they are generated in a moving sequence, the one from the other. Although each is complete in itself, and each includes the other two, there is still a dynamic advance from inert and unfathomable existence to life, with its unfolding potential and inherent logic to the completeness of comprehension. To be is to live, to be expressed, and to express is to know, eventually with serene understanding. To proclaim a Trinitarian ontology on this view, which later re-emerges via Maximus in the East and Erigena in the West, is to say that everything created by God is also in some degree alive, also in some degree a completed act of comprehension. It is also to say that just as God returns to himself via his understanding, goes from beginning through the middle to return to the beginning when he sees his own being, so all creatures exist as returning to the ultimate source. Thus their death is not the end, but a final development. And when they die, they do not renounce all that they have become, as for a Neoplatonic ascent, but complete and resume it, take it back with them. I think there are hints of this resumption in Plato's Phaedrus as well. For return is now ontologically resurrection, both by a natural rebound and by the grace of Christ, through whom we see that the outgoing and the return in God, and the outgoing and return of creatures are really all one single outgoing and return, despite their inseparable difference, since nothing can be added to God. Trinitarian ontology gives us a perspective upon self-induced catastrophe and apocalyptic. Are we not returning everything to this bare-toothed existence because we have failed to believe that everything which exists has the dignity and momentousness of life, and the dignity and momentousness of a degree of understanding? That everything that is also dynamic and psychic and meaningful. That although each thing is made, it is also eternal, since it discloses an irreplaceable good. Eternal as made by the single, simple action of God, which is in no respect accidental or contingent. But we can know also that our worst failures are also bound to be thwarted. We cannot really destroy life and understanding any more than we can destroy being, because being is that which dynamically manifests itself, and so lives and knows itself. Any act of destruction on our part, any flood or fire or released disease, any destruction of the civic peace and order, is not really the ending of existence, but only the death of the finite, which is the beginning of a rebound. Certainly a rebound to eternity, to God's simpleness, but also perhaps for now a return away from false, over-elaborated life and spurious, sophistic, virtuosic modes of wisdom. A purging return to a purging chance of a simpler life, to an existence more about dwelling with nature and enjoying nature, and seeking more to understand her and ourselves, rather than inventing ever new devices that reveal nothing but our own contrivances. A life which is more naturally a channel for goodness and open to the reception of the necessary extra of grace, which some of the Christian fathers identified with beauty. Today's conference, convened really against all odds, is somehow at the heart of everything. It's like the headquarters of a kind of metaphysical Bletchley Park, trying to understand the hidden codes obscured beneath the distracting tinselly twinkles of our world. With particular thanks then, as I mentioned, to our overseas speakers for braving travel or the perils of online connection, to our UK and Cambridge contributors, and to our MPhil students who are chairing the sessions, and of course thanks to Ryan Haecker and Sebastian Milbank, who I think is on his way, for organising this crucial event today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Pickstock. Welcome, everyone, to the University of Cambridge and to the Faculty of Divinity, and welcome to the New Trinitarian Ontologies Symposium. In September of 2020, we had hosted an international and ecumenical New Trinitarian Ontologies conference, which featured 33 guest speakers and over 300 guest delegates from all over the world. This New Trinitarian Ontology Symposium is a student response to the themes of that conference. It is the second in a projected series of 3 events on the theme of Trinitarian Ontologies, of which the third is scheduled to be held in Bologna, Italy in June of 2020. New Trinitarian Ontologies names a new way of speaking about the structure of being, of metaphysics, and of ontology, imitation of the Trinity. It speaks of ontology as Trinitarian. It is not an ontology of the Trinity, but a Trinitarian ontology, as it attempts to speak of being as it is spoken in and by the Trinity. It thus doubly refuses, as in Hegel, any assimilation of the Trinity to representation of a pure concept, and in Heidegger of any suspension of the Trinity as a form of the forgetting of the primordial disclosure of being. Against both of these poles of its impossibility, Trinitarian Ontologies asks the question of faith before the question of being, and speaks from its source before this gift can be closed into any system of a closed ontology. It thus speaks from the hinterland of contemporary theory, and from the margins of academic theology, as a subterranean tradition of Christian philosophy, which, while once submerged in late medieval nominalism and early modern idealism, has since the late modern critiques of formal and foundational ontologies newly erupted at this present day into the open era of free speculation. To ask this question of Trinitarian ontology is again to ask the simplest question of what is being, as it may yet be answered with the absolute question of what is God. It begins with what seems the simplest and richest of philosophical questions, for it speaks with Aristotle of what simply is, and with Augustine of the creative cause of all being. Starting with Scotus, Suarez, and Leibniz, this speech of being in general metaphysics came to be distinguished as a transcendental science of ontology, ontoslogia. Once, however, ontology had been separated from theology, God could be conceived as the most real being, in realissimum, and the supreme being of all beings in theology of ontology, that is, in an ontotheology, in which the speech of God may be simulated in and for this speech of being. Such a spectral conception of God as a supreme being of ontotheology is, as Nietzsche and Heidegger had recognized, the oldest root of modern idealism, modern atheism. For in elevating the idea of one supreme being over many particular beings, God appears both in and beyond all beings, in an ontological difference of being over and against beings, in an inner opposition of being to beings, and an opposition that ultimately evacuates being into nothing as nihilism. The God of ontology is, as Jacobi had warned against Kant, thus an idol of pure reason that evacuates being into the system of that is not being, but nothing, that is, so as to subvert the system of being as ontology into a system of non-being as me ontology, where it is at last impossible to speak of any ontology as Trinitarian. Hegel and Heidegger have in the modern era presented the two poles of the impossibility of Trinitarian ontology. For Hegel had constructed an encyclopedic system of ontology, starting with absolutely indeterminate being, and Heidegger had, to the contrary, deconstructed every such ontological construction by the questioning of the originating meaning of being in the plenitude of its eruptive disclosure. Hegel had thus collected the difference of being into the center, while Heidegger had dispersed this difference beyond but between beings and time. And where Hegel had constructed a system, Heidegger had deconstructed any system in what we may call an anti-system that subverts any construction of being as in writing in ever more radical nihilism. Most analytic ontology has, following Frege, presupposed the forms of logic as an axiomatic foundation, while most continental philosophy has, following Husserl, alternatively presupposed the content of phenomenal intuitions as an adhering foundation. Such foundations of formal ontology have, however, since been subverted, both by Gödel's critique of foundations of mathematics and Heidegger's critique of the construction of ontology. Wilfred von Orman-Quine and Jacques Derrida have since hinted at the dissolution of all such foundations, and Richard Rorty and Alain Badiou have since heralded the return of practice and realism in metaphysics, which now invites a new investigation into Trinitarian ontologies. The question of Trinitarian ontology has in this way since opened up from the fissures of secular philosophy. It was first explicitly raised in a 1976 letter by Bishop Klaus Himmerl to Hans Urs von Balthasar. Himmerl had found in Balthasar a recollection of the event-like character of Christian doctrine that transforms the speech of being, quote, from out of the heart of our faith, from the Christ event, as it is read in a Trinitarian fashion, end quote. Trinitarian ontology is for Himmel, as for Danelu and Lubach, a ressourcement of the Trinitarian shaping of ontology, as it asks again to answer anew this ontological question in imitation of the Trinity. The novelty arises in it in asking the question of ontology as the structure of being is shaped in and by the Trinity. It aims to recollect what was lost and what may yet be recovered for a Trinitarian and Christian answer to the question of faith, where it is in fact the Trinity that shapes ontology. To restore Trinitarian ontology today, we must return to recollect this question of the Trinity in a new way. We must not merely draw the past into the present, but we must more radically leap over all that is past that is present, so we may found a new beginning. The Eucharist, I suggest, can be read as a clue to this recollection. For in its gratuitous semiotic plenitude, it can neither be included in nor excluded from ontology, but can, on the contrary, only be encountered as it is consumed, and consumed as it is consummated in recollection. This recollection, in the aperture of the Eucharist, of all that is past, can thus be read to have prepared the path for us to travel between the two poles of the impossibility of Trinitarian ontology. This question of Trinitarian ontology can be traced at the very beginning of Christian theology, for the Gospel of John begins with a new narration of the Genesis account of creation. It speaks of how the Word, the Logos, was with God, was God, even as the Word was made flesh. As with God, the difference of the Logos enters into the world, and as was God, this difference is also identical to God in a difference in identity. We find here an expression of the entire problematic of Trinitarian ontology. For every speech of what is as being is spoken in and with the Logos, and the Logos is spoken as difference in identity with Christ, as Christ communicates the Logos, as he is made within this world and of his own making. To speak of the being of ontology is already in the Gospel of John, to speak in and with the Logos, as the Logos is spoken by the Son, and the Son is made in Christ, in a speech that is only spoken over this very creative repetition of the intertrinitarian divine difference. Being is spoken from the beginning in such creative repetition of this divine difference. Origin of Alexandria had interpreted the divine I am of Exodus 3:14 as an enunciation by the Logos of the divine being, Usia, that is spoken in every speech of being. The ontological difference of being from beings is thus already a repetition of this divine difference, as it is instantly intermediated, reflected, and communicated through the three divine persons. We may witness, in this sense, how the classical Trinitarian controversies, those of Arianism, Sabellianism, and Macedonianism, all pivot around a kind of unmediated agonic difference. For in each controversy, the free first difference of the Son from the Father is suppressed in an eruptive opposition that is no less violently sutured in an identity of the same. And in answer we may find among the Athanasius, the Cappadocians, and Augustine a much more radical reaffirmation of the repetition of a difference that is shown to be pacified as it proceeds over this creative difference of the Logos in any speech as ontology. With this development of classical Trinitarian doctrine, the controversy soon turned from the Trinity to Christology, and from Christology to any representation of Christ, symbolically in the icons and yet substantively in the Eucharist. The divine difference of the Trinity in Christ is at this point repeated in the difference of the separable accidents of the bread and the wine in and for the divine presence of Christ in the Eucharist. For in the transformation of the substance of the bread and the wine through the host into the body and blood of Christ, the accidental appearances of bread and wine are, as for Duns Scotus, released into a virtual domain of formal distinctions. The divine difference of the Trinity of Christ in the Eucharist could, at the aperture of this fissure, then be virtually simulated as a fully semantic ontology. This medieval controversy concerning the Eucharist is, as I shall suggest, the focal aperture within which opens to be presented the two poles of the impossibility of Trinitarian ontology. It is, in a certain sense, a continuation of a late medieval controversy. For as early as its Carolingian controversies, interpretation of the divine presence in the host of the Eucharist had diverged between symbolic real and substantive ideal interpretations. And after the reality of this presence had, with Scotus and Occam, been framed in the ideality of a univocal ontology, the presence of any substance whatsoever could be virtually simulated, first outwardly with Francisco Suarez in ontology, then inwardly with René Descartes in epistemology, and finally in the closed systematic of Hegel and the open anti-systematic of Heidegger. Hegel and Heidegger present for modern philosophy two poles of the impossibility of this speech of Trinitarian ontology. Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel's encyclopedia system opens from the absolute indeterminacy of being that dialectically determines the conceptual self-mediation of the idea of logic before externally unfolding into nature, internally unfolding into spirit, and in its spiritual self-reflexivity, collecting all determinations in a closed dialectical circuit, that of an intrinsically self-differentiating identity. Yet since this dialectic also knows every identity into a new negation, and every negation into a further determination, this self-mediating, self-differentiating identity must equally oppose in its negative determinacy its free release of pure being. Friedrich Wilhelm Joseph Schelling comes at this point both before and after Hegel. For before Hegel, he had inaugurated the unity of the ideal and the real in the absolute, that is, identity philosophy. And after Hegel, in his freedom essay, he shows how the dialectic of being can be both negated and determined as a negative philosophy in and for the positive philosophy of this free positing of being. Yet absent of any conceptual self-mediation, Schelling's positive being could afterwards be constructed into a positive science of physics, of psychology, and later of phenomenology, where, with Husserl and Heidegger, it reflects again upon so as to question the constitution of its own being. Martin Heidegger's Being in Time questions then so as to analyze the meaning of one's own being, of Dasein, in the many modes of space and time, and in contributions to philosophy, as it is released from being to the event arrivedness, and as open to the fourfold Das Gewährt of its various relations. He has, in this event, radicalized Schelling's pure positing of being as the station of the abyss that opens up between being and nothing. Yet in positing being over this station, that is the nothing, das Nicht, Heidegger has also collapsed this difference into a more intensive repetition of difference as equally of identity, not as nothing, but as something, in a dialectical reversal of negativism as a new positivism, which is also for him the foundation of a new ontology. Jacques Derrida of grammatology thereafter exhibits the explicit negativity of this dialectic of deconstruction, in which deconstruction differentiates the identity of its difference in an infinite difference of any different as identity, and the deconstruction by the same differentiation of any text, of speech, and of thought. Yet in this infinite difference, deconstruction also destroys any identical concept of its own immanent operation. What remains after the deconstruction of deconstruction is only this dialectic of this supplement in its immanent subversion. The search for the originary supplement in so much of French continental philosophy thus returns to recollect the very source of its supplementarity, in which any and all supplements point from what is secondary back to that which is primary. With this destruction and deconstruction, we may witness in both the analytic and continental traditions a certain return to realism in metaphysics, in which momentously in Alain Badiou, the event opens up for the construction of a new ontology. The event is, for Badiou, the decision to count the multiple as one in the construction of a mathematical ontology. Now, as with Heidegger, he refused as inconsistent any ontology of the Trinity. Since, however, any one decisional event for Badiou is as free and undetermined as any other, the decision of the event can also be opposed by any other in an unrestricted freedom of ontological constructions. This opens up the window from secular philosophy to new Trinitarian ontologies. A third way between the two poles of the impossibility of Trinitarian ontology has at this point been opened up for us from within philosophy. We may, following Catherine Pickstock, take the Eucharist as a clue to this recollection of the question of Trinitarian ontologies. For it appears to doubly exceed the two poles of the impossibility two poles of the impossibility in the closed ontology of Hegel and the open me-ontology of Heidegger. It is not possible to consume, but only to be consumed, in any possible univocal regime of virtual representations. For both Hegel and Heidegger, the real presence of Christ fades into the empty signified without signification. In Hegel, the Eucharist appears as a Lutheran symbol of remembrance of the representations of pure concept, and in Heidegger, it appears as a pagan sacrifice of the dwelling of the gods, but for neither is the signification of this supplemental matter really consumed in the performance of its recollection. This problematic of recollection had been framed in Plato's Minos paradox. In the Meno, Socrates had hinted how there appears to be a paradox in the possibility of learning. For if a thing is known, then learning is not necessary, yet if a thing is not known, then learning is not possible. Augustine had later argued and emphasized in Book 10 of his Confessions how the solution to the Minos paradox, that is the possibility of learning, requires neither the searchable unknown nor the unsearchable known, but rather the productive memory of the pastness that is made present, fatio, in the present, in the mind cogito, such that the memory is made in each activity of knowing in unknowing, in search of unknowing and knowing, reminiscent of Nicholas of Cusa's learned ignorance. For Augustine, the presence of knowing in the knowing must be communicated through the material-mediated potency, which opens up at the aperture of its absence to be drawn in every act of knowing. We may, within this circuit, remember not only our own memories, but also our own memory of having remembered, in a mnemonic surplus that makes the past in and for the present. It is this mnemonic surplus that I suggest will be the key to solving Minos' paradox as well as any possible recollection, for it can only be communicated in the material-mediated potency of knowing, which, while foreknown, is also created in the surplus of all that is known as knowing in unknowing. Recollection thus assumes a new symbolic form in the Eucharist, for as Augustine first fully appreciated, the Eucharist is presented as a substance that is saturated with a circuit of signs that cycles through its chains of signification in a circuit of recollection. The Eucharistic rite is thus performed as a recollection. Its shining signification is traced through all of the orders of signs. Every remembrance of pastness is produced in for the present, and indeed in any attempt at recollection. This semiotic circuit of the Eucharist thus shows the simplest form of the mnemonic circuit, that is of the recollection of the Eucharist, in which the remembering of signs, we may once more begin to recollect the singularity of all signification that is spoken as it is spoken. New Trinitarian Ontologies names this third way of thinking about being as a gift that may imitate in its relations the triple relationality as it is given and spoken. In contrast to Hegel and Heidegger, New Trinitarian Ontologies speaks of being neither as indeterminate nor as determinate, but only as it is determined in and by this gift from another that too is given in its being, to give again and be itself through this gift. It is always already determined in the riches of its relations, of a determinacy that can be both dispersed and collected beyond and for any further determination, and ultimately as being in its utmost simplicity is absolutely determined in and by the triple relationality of God as Trinity. This gift of being then marks the mutual relationality of its determinability from another in which it is equally a gift from one to the next for itself and altogether as many made one. The question of faith can at this point be asked again after after the construction and deconstruction of ontology, before the question of being, and a questioning that answers as by receiving being as a gift, as the gift of the Eucharist. For uniquely in the Eucharist, there is no separation between the signifier and the signified, as the entire semiotic circuit is presented as it is performed in a circuit of recollection. Theology may thus mark a momentous reversal of modern ontology, for it uniquely asks the question of faith in God who speaks of being before we may speak of any question of being at all. And yet, in its doctrinal answers, it also speaks through this very difference of God from God as many made one in and through the Trinity. New Trinitarian Ontologies names this recollection from the sources, a ressourcement, of the thinking of ontologies as Trinitarian, that is, new in its very narration. In the tradition of Nouvelle Theologie, New Trinitarian Ontologies is a new narration of the ontology of the Trinity as it developed through the development of doctrine. It narrates the story of Trinitarian ontology, its patristic formation, its medieval submergence, and its modern eruption from the fissures that have opened up within secular philosophy, and from the spirit as always is abiding to reflect upon, to draw forth a new development that ever was in the hidden destiny of its final truth. Its newness can in this way come both before and after modern ontology, for the novelty of its historicality is a product of its own relations, and yet it is most of all in search through the traces of its history that we may find the fissures of an ontology that is Trinitarian. The Trinity is, we may argue, free from all foundations, for the form of the Trinity is never founded on any form of logic or content of phenomena apart from the free love of the divine persons. Trinitarian ontologies may be at once more Christian, more incarnational, and yet also more critically open to engage with the cutting-edge theoretical efforts of our time in all the disciplines of the arts and humanities. We wish for this purpose to invite you all to participate in this momentous event. We will convene 4 panels today, each consisting of 3 successive 20-minute papers, followed by 30 minutes of questions and answers fielded from roving microphones from our audience. We have 2 breaks with coffee and tea downstairs at 11 a.m. and 3:30, as well as lunch at Selwyn College at 1 p.m. After the 4th panel, we will invite a few concluding remarks from Professor Jeffrey Bishop. And after the conclusion of the symposium, we invite you all to join us for a choral evensong celebration at Sydney Sussex College. Please allow me now to introduce, as the chair of our first panel, Keela Robinson, who is currently studying in this faculty for an MPhil in Christian theology.